Good afternoon, and welcome to a special 90-minute joint webinar for Remaking the Economy with MPQ and Shelterforce called Social Housing, a Path to Housing for All. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of our Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
Great. And hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Axelute. I'm the CEO Editor-in-Chief at Shelterforce Magazine, a national magazine that covers affordable housing and community development here in Albany, New York, land of the Haudenosaunee and the Mohican.
Great, and for this webinar, we are honored to introduce our four expert panelists who are Gianpaolo Baiocchi, a sociologist at New York University and a leading author of a proposal to develop a social housing development agency. Bernie Mazik, President and CEO of the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development. Crystal Okafor, law candidate, Ruth Tilden Kern Scholar, and Moelis Urban Law and Public Affairs Fellow at New York University School of Law. And Roberto de la Riva Rojas, co-director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, United Renters for Justice, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A few notes. First of all, we're very excited to take your questions. We will start with some slides and questions, then get to yours. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of the screen, and I will share as many of them as I can. Second, we will share the slides and recording after the webinar, so please don't ask, will I get the slides and recording? You will. One new feature today, we are making translation into Spanish available. Para escuchar el webinar en español, por favor, selecciona Spanish, donde dice interpretation. And to listen in English, you should already be set. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing it is not. So if you like what we're doing and can afford to support MPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider making a donation to MPQ today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media. We have the hashtag Rebuild the Economy. Thanks for joining us, and there'll be a survey at the end, so please complete that, which informs our future work. And with that, we'll begin with Crystal.
All right, thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. As Steve said, my name is Crystal Okafor. I am a JD candidate, a Ruth Tilden Kern Scholar, and Moelis Urban Law and Public Affairs Fellow at the New York University School of Law. Last fall, I published a paper with my colleague Sophie House titled Under One Roof, an Abolitionist Approach to Housing Justice. And I'm excited to share some of our thinking with you today, as well as to ignite a conversation on how a social housing agenda, an agenda rooted in housing that is decommodified, available to all who want and need it, housing removed from the private market, can also be an agenda for racially just housing. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the Black women on whose shoulders I stand, folks like Sandy Lynn Hamer and Shirley Sherrod, who reimagined what collective care and social provision could look like in this country. So let's get into it. What are we to make of the incendiary summer of 2020? Next slide. So it's a time when rental arrears were mounting. Over the course of the summer, renter households accumulated $12.2 billion to $16.7 billion in owed rent. It's also a time when people of color were most affected. When it came to COVID cases, COVID mortality, COVID-related job loss, Latinx and Black households were hit the hardest. At the same time, the summer of 2020 was a magical moment. It was a time of mass mobilization of an unprecedented scale. You had rent strikers and encampment protesters calling for cancel rent. You had mutual aid efforts modeling a politics of interdependence and reciprocity. And of course, there was a multiracial uprising honoring the inherent dignity and worth of Black life. It was a time when actors in the criminal legal system were finally being forthright about this through line of pervasive and persistent anti-Blackness that colors their work. It's a through line that connects chattel slavery, the Black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. As folks who work in housing policy, care deeply about housing, organize around housing and in housing, we know that that same through line is embedded in our line of work. It's one that connects the racial terror that motivated the Great Migration, to exclusionary zoning and redlining, to urban renewal and the white and capital flight, to New Deal exclusion, and to the predatory inclusion of today. That, to me, means that housing policy needs abolition too. Next slide. So what then might abolition teach us about housing? Today I'm going to share 3 lessons from abolitionists that we can apply to our own work. Next slide. So the first lesson that I want to sort of elevate for the group is around building new institutions. Abolitionists are sort of charged themselves with abolishing the relics of slavery, what liberals would often call institutional racism, and they want to do that through the creation of new institutions. I imagine that folks on this call have some new institutions top of mind for them if they were to try to reinvigorate housing provision in this country. If we want to confer housing stability, we would do that typically by relinquishing our market-based housing system. Our new institutions would be things like limited equity co-ops and shared equity co-ops that are allowing for low-cost home ownership, community land trusts and other forms of collective land ownership, democratically controlled housing secured via tenant opportunity to purchase and community opportunity to purchase legislation, even community financing programs that allow us to raise money to acquire land without engaging usurious lenders. In my mind, though, we have to pair these sort of new institutions that are removing land from the private market with interventions that can abolish the legacy of slavery through repair. We need levers, policy levers, that can undo the historic and racialized dispossession that people of color, especially Black folks, have faced in this country. What's coming to mind for me are things like the Pigford v. Glickman decision, which led to payouts for Black farmers who were historically discriminated against by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a period of discrimination that catalyzed Black land loss in the Deep South. I'm also thinking of the Evanston, Illinois reparations initiative, which has been getting a lot of press recently. They decided to offer true reparations to the Black folks within their jurisdiction by offering down payment assistance and home repair assistance to qualifying households. Next slide. So a second lesson from abolitionists that we can apply to our work in housing is around pursuing non-reformist reforms. This is a mouthful, but it's an important one. Anytime an abolitionist makes an intervention into a noxious system, they're working with the intent on shrinking that system, eroding that system, unwinding that system, never growing the reach of, building the power of, further entrenching that system. In the context of the criminal legal system, instead of pursuing things like body cameras or police training, an abolitionist would pursue a defund campaign that would siphon resources from the cops and invest in the sort of policy levers that are going to confer what they believe is true public safety and community care. I think if we are looking to abandon some of the reformist reforms that we typically apply in housing policy, then we have to think about how we can forego the incrementalism that has long been at the center of our work. In housing policy, we are known to offer term-limited rental assistance, a 6-month voucher, a 1-year voucher, to households who we know their rent and wages will not reach parity within 6 months' time or 1 year's time. We're also known to offer light touch housing, service-free housing to households that are burdened by intergenerational trauma. Worst of all, we're known to construct workforce housing to accommodate teachers and firefighters, despite the dearth of affordable housing at the bottom of the market, housing that home health aides can afford or food service workers can afford. Housing policy is often a stopgap measure. How might we pivot from transactional approaches to transformational ones? How might we pivot from incremental approaches to exponential ones? I think abolition compels us to pursue non-reformist reforms, to unwind noxious systems, and to build a world in which noxious systems are obsolete. What would the world look like what would a world in which housing court is obsolete look like? It could be a world in which there is a federal home guarantee, such that anyone who is in need of housing, wants state-sponsored housing, can get it, such that no one is at risk of eviction. That's what a non-reformist reform lens can give us. Next slide. So the third and final lesson I'd like to offer from abolitionist theory and practice is around amplifying the voices of impacted populations. Abolitionists work to be led by and offer material support to those who are most impacted by the criminal legal system. And I think in housing policy, especially among housing policy decision makers, this is going to require a sea change if we were to apply this sort of dogma. We really must rethink our relationship with social movements. There is often a defanged, technocratic, neoliberal pragmatism that colors our work. I'll say that again. There's a defanged, technocratic, neoliberal pragmatism that colors our work. We know that so often the solutions that we're proffering are inadequate. We know that that 6-month voucher or that 1-year voucher is not enough, but we still pursue it. We know that that service-free housing is not enough for mom and children if they're burdened by a DV episode, but we still do it. Yet when movements highlight solutions that are more comprehensive, that are wholesale solutions, things like a housing guarantee, things like cancel rent, they're dismissed as naive or unrefined. It's so important for people with authority over housing policy decision-making to forego the false distinctions they make between impacted populations and activists on one hand, and the so-called experts, the developers, the property managers, etc., the WOM. Next slide. So is social housing a new institution that our communities need to thrive? I'm going to assume that there's a general consensus among folks on this call about what our neighborhoods truly need, the things that we've been saying for years. Housing as a human right and not as an asset class. Housing for people and not for profit. Development without displacement. Community control of land and housing. Next slide. Can social housing get us there? I think only if the acquisition, development, and provision of social housing embeds a racial equity lens that breaks that through line of pervasive and persistent anti-Blackness that I mentioned earlier. And that's going to be tough because I think there's an inherent tension in social housing that makes it kind of tricky as a racial equity tool. And there's also a nefarious and superficial politics of racial justice that has arisen over the course of the past year. In terms of that inherent tension within social housing, we know that social housing in this country, if it were to fully be institutionalized, would rely on limited equity and shared equity models that hinder the amount of wealth that one can generate from their home. What might that mean for Black folks who have not had access to tools for the generation of intergenerational wealth, the sort of wealth that offers a cushion during times of the pandemic, the sort of wealth that white folks were able to build in the New Deal era? So we have to think about how these models fit together with a racial justice agenda. And there's also the co-optation of racial justice over the past year. You'll see this with politicians who are trying to use racial justice as a stalking horse for speculation. They'll say it's time to redirect capital to disinvested communities, meaning that they want to upzone disinvested communities, allow for greater commercial and residential development that will ultimately displace the low-income people of color who've lived in these communities for decades. Or they'll proffer racial equity impact analyses that give us more data on how we're being exploited and oppressed in our cities, but do not lead to redistribution or reparative approaches to make us whole once again. We have to reconcile all of this if we're trying to pursue social housing and racial justice simultaneously and with rigor. I'm optimistic about our ability to reach synergy on this front because I know that there are models from which we can pull. I want to invoke again the Black women whose names I said at the beginning of my remarks, Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Sherrod. They are both radical Black women of the 1960s who are working in the tradition of cooperative economics. Fannie Lou Hamer founded her Freedom Farm Co-op, what she called a syndicate of friends and brothers, where Black people lived and worked together on land commonly held and ended the precarity that they experienced in exploitative sharecropping relationships. Shirley Sherrod, for her part, is one of the co-founders of New Communities, Inc., one of the nation's first community land trusts. It was a bulwark against the Black land law. She erected a tripartite board in which residents, neighbors, and public leaders held land in trust, made decisions about how that land would be run together. These lessons from history, these lessons from today's movements and from the movements of yesteryear, I think demonstrate that it's incumbent upon us to craft a social housing. It's incumbent upon us, and it's quite possible among us, to craft a social housing agenda that has racial justice at its center. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Crystal. And I think that sets up Gianpaolo really well. Gianpaolo, look forward to hearing from you and talk about your paper on social housing and your vision for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Crystal. A couple of acknowledgements. Thank you to Steve and Miriam for putting this event together. I have a lot of respect and appreciation for everyone who's on the call with me. And among the attendees are lots of people whose work we deeply respect and draw from also. My email was at the very beginning. I thrive, my colleagues and I thrive on debate and discussion. So please, any feedback you have on any of this is always, always welcome. You know, we make the road by walking it. So everything is a work in progress. You know where you want to go generally, but we really count on folks. So one more acknowledgement too is that today I'm going to be talking about the Social Housing Development Authority proposal and a little bit about this paper. Both of those were co-written with Jake Carlson, a colleague of mine who I believe is among the attendants. But this is part of a bigger collaborative effort. I have the colleagues Sarah Dubisek, Marnie Brady, Ned Crowley, who work with us, and we're kind of like a policy crew. And we're constantly in discussion with people from different housing advocacy movements, Right to the City, Housing Justice for All, among others. So I am in deep alignment with everything Crystal said, and I'm just going to take up from where she left and see if we can't push the ball a little bit, continue to push the ball forward. So when we think about social housing, I think thinking about that phrase social and housing together is also an invitation for us to be imaginative and a little utopian. And it invites us to think about housing as something other than just an economic good. You know, we think of housing in this country as the means to wealth, as the American dream, as a property, as something you flip. But really, housing, the invitation is for us to think of housing as something more than that. For example, as a right, or as we like to talk about it, as a social good. To think about housing as a social good means to recognize all the ways that housing, poor, bad, segregated, not segregated, expensive, affordable, all that impacts the social world. And we have to begin to think of housing as closer to something like education or health. It's not a public good in economist terms, because when you and your collective and group is using a housing someone else is not using, but it's never fully a private good. And one of the lies we've been sold on in this country is that housing is a private good, primarily to be bought and sold. First of all, if we look at the longer history of this country, the original inhabitants did not think of land as a commodity, and we've come to think of land as a fictitious commodity on top of which housing is normally built. Since when does land have to have an economic value? Also, it invites us to think about the degrees of market control over housing. So a lot of times, Crystal was mentioning the excellent examples of limited equity cooperatives, community land trusts. There's a level of degree of how much market we're going to allow. Other things like regulations on housing quality, limits on pricing, tenants' bill of rights, all those things push against the pure economic thinking around housing. And once we think about housing as this sort of important thing in our society, something with tremendous impact, and something so tied, for example, as we write about in the paper with the history of racial capitalism in this country, we can begin to think of housing in the other way. How can housing serve the function to unwind and undo some of those noxious relationships, to use Crystal's terms? I was going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, but let me just say about why social housing, one of the many things social housing is good for, is that it works. One of the things social housing is better at than purely private housing is that the interests of residents are aligned with the collective. In private rental housing, it's you against the landlord. The evidence is actually pretty clear too, that in social housing, because we are able to pool our resources together and collective, we can weather storms much better than the private market. So let me get to the utopian part, and let me talk a little bit about some of the ways that we're thinking that we need to move in that direction. So when we talk about social housing, it's about putting the social into housing too. It's imagining a kind of housing that's production, distribution, management, is guided by deeply democratic principles, a logic of intentional inclusion and anti-racism, an ethos of care and environmental stewardship, and very importantly for us, it has to be publicly backed to function at scale. You talk to anybody in any community land trust, in any cooperative, anywhere in the world, they will tell you public backing makes all the difference in us being able to do this work at scale. I love all the examples of cooperatives and community land trusts that I've been able to visit, but I've yet to visit one where people have said, well, we don't need public backing. Public backing is fundamental. And if you think about the history of this country, private housing is publicly backed. The mortgage deduction interest is the tune of $80 billion a year. That's been alive as long as there's been an Internal Revenue Service. That is public money that we spend with private housing. There's many, many more examples of that. But when we think about social housing, it's very important to not forget this idea of public backing. So how do we move in that direction, and why do we need to move in that direction urgently? As Steve mentioned, my colleague Jake and I and the rest of the collective are authors of this idea of the Social Housing Development Authority. We're imagining, and we are in discussion with folks federally, at the state level, municipally, institutions that will acquire distressed housing. So in the example of New York, one of the very many private equity owned buildings that's now in trouble, acquire that distressed housing, hold it, bring it up to standards, that is the public backing, and then facilitate its transfer to the nonprofit sector, to the cooperative sector. We can talk about some details, but the idea is that private equity, when we first began to write about this a year ago, private equity had $350 billion in what they call dry powder. That is money getting ready, the liquidity that no one else has had in this crisis to invest in this distressed housing. We've had the opportunity to attend some of these private equity webinars before they got wise to us. I could just sign up and attend. And they're talking about this housing crisis, this eviction crisis as a bonanza that's going to hurt folks of color, that's going to move money from the hands of renters and individuals to big corporations and private equity. Now the amount of dry powder we're talking about is close to $1 trillion. So it's imperative that the federal government step in and crowd out these investors and purchase, particularly that residential real estate, and put it in the hands of communities. We also believe that acquiring distressed real estate is one of the pillars. We believe the homes guarantee, the Ilhan Omar proposal, is extremely important. We believe that there will be a need to create new units of social housing. We believe there needs to be a national set of reforms around tenants' rights. And we believe public housing needs to be upgraded and democratized. So these are the 4 pillars we see of this transition. And we think of these as things that need to be happening, transitional strategies, and we don't think of them as reformists. We think of these as non-reformist reforms because it will allow us, the public, the cooperatives, the activists, the people who count, to have a stake in the way that the housing system operates in this country. Thank you.
Great, thanks. A lot to think about there. And let me encourage folks to put questions in the question box, and we'll do our best to get to those. And Roberto, the floor is yours. And I guess there's some slides here, so we'll get those up.
Thank you. Today I'm going to share about the struggle to win our cooperative, our decommodified housing cooperative of 69 units, roughly 200 people here 2 blocks away just from the 3rd precinct. But before I start today, I want to say some names of fighters that have fought with us and who have been fighting for their truth for generations but have passed away in our movement. Maria Zavala. Say it with me too in your computer. Eric Oneka, Raekwon Martin, Maria Alvarado. These are people who gave their lives to the movement, who built with us, who understand why we're dreaming. We don't need to convince anybody why we need social housing because they know it in their guts. And this is how we move. And so the struggle started roughly around 4 years ago with one of the biggest landlords in Minneapolis. It was 1,500 units, 5,000 people, mainly BIPOC housing, single mothers, people coming out of shelter. It was one of the only affordable housing areas within Minneapolis. And we flipped that on the script and we said, this is naturally occurring profitable housing because the landlord was getting 70% profit margin off these communities. People are getting rich from our communities. And it's not that we're just kind of trying to decide where we want to go. Next slide, please. I think something that's really, really important is understanding how we organized and what we did. We did everything under the sun. We protested his church. We protested the Catholic church that was connected to the evictions. We served subpoenas to him while he was praying. We protested at his mansion. We went down and protested the city council. We galvanized this issue. Before we started organizing, there was only 2 complaint-driven inspectors for over 90,000 units. Now you can imagine who's living in the units, and you can imagine how these landlords are getting away with murder. And I'm completely in 100% agreement with Crystal. It's abolition or bust, because when you're organizing the system and you see this, you see how deeply embedded it is. That this landlord was one of the best landlords in Minneapolis before we started organizing, connected to the police union, connected to the city council chambers, connected to people who helped him win his buildings after we showed up. We led the largest class action lawsuit in the history of the United States, returning more than $12 million back to tenants. And that wasn't because we had high-powered lawyers that wanted to do some good work. It's because the people did not want to get paid out. And they say, we want justice. We don't want just this measly $5,000. And this is how things had opened up. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Maria Zavala. 4 years ago, she was threatened with eviction as she was on dialysis, unable to move from her bed because she was asking for heat in her own apartment. She was asking for to not have infestations of cockroaches, to not have infestations of bed bugs. But just because we're destroying the landlord's profit margin with the people who decide where we want to go. Mind you, we had more than 250 community meetings of people coming together and deciding their strategic direction. It's not like we're some, honchos here deciding how we're going to move. We're moving with the people. And when you do an asamblea process, when you do a people process that moves people, that opens up for transformation and allows dreams to come true that we already know exist in our bodies based in what we've been going through every day. And so Maria Zavala was a steadfast fighter, and just so happened that she passed away right before we won the cooperative. Next slide, please. We galvanized this issue. We didn't even go to just tenants. We didn't only go to city council members, but we made the blocks hot. This was a eviction defense that we invited the sheriff after we were occupying some of the buildings, in which we said, we're going to defend these evictions. These are not moral. Any eviction isn't moral because when you go to court, it's complete setup. But and we did that by showing up in court, having pizza parties in court, filling the courtrooms, looking the landlords in their eyes and saying that we're here to defend. But this is something important because we started to move the narrative around, maybe what's happening in these buildings isn't fair, and maybe what the landlord is doing is completely violent and has been completely destroying our city, destroying our buildings, hurting our public tax dollars at the expense of people who make the city run. And so we kind of got the sheriff to say, enough is it. We got them to say that, I'll work with you a little bit based on how much people they saw in power. Next slide. I want to just completely remind you that we're nestled in between all the struggle and the uprising here, 3 blocks away from the 3rd precinct, which we created a security patrol, mainly female body individuals within our cooperative, in which we realized that police are just not necessary. Our block, our office is half a block away from what you're seeing here. This is the George Floyd Square Autonomous Zone. Next slide. This is what some of the buildings looked like before. Where we're at now is we put $1 million into these buildings. We forced a landlord to sell them. We got a bunch of backing from the city, but it's only because we had organization and we were hot. We were hot and we were there and we didn't stop. Like I said, no heat in the winter, massive floods, children living in this mold, lead paint, destroying IQ levels, all this kind of stuff where you start to understand why this is mass violence by just owning property and being a landlord in nature. It gives them credence to commit violence, and the system backs them up until we say, no, ya basta, let's stop. Next slide. So this is a slide which is pretty powerful. You see there's neighbors, not only cooperative members, in which our tenants are coming to take down the old signs of apartment shop. In the background, you see the pillar of transformation. We developed 4 or 5 different pillars made by community murals and made by people within our movement to say what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so you can kind of see in this picture how transformation is evoking in themselves. You can imagine what it means to live under this oppression of this landlord. The person who is coming to take the sign down is Vanessa, who had the landlord charge in on her when we were organizing while she was breastfeeding her son. So we got to take down those signs and reimagine and rethink of where we want to go in terms of Giampolo and what we're saying about social housing. Next slide. And so we're Sky Without Limits Cooperative. We're in the process of transitioning into our cooperative model to see what we're going to be, but it's very clear. We're taking housing out of the market. We're going to keep it in community forever, and we're going to build something else that looks and feels great in the bodies of people, and we're going to defend that in a zone that is hot. When the rents are going to be $2,000, $3,000 around us, we're going to be the most affordable housing in the city. And the idea is to keep taking over buildings, keep organizing and forcing landlords to sell their buildings so that we can create territory and build a movement based on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Roberto. And Bernie, you're last up, and we're moving from Minnesota to South Carolina, very different political environment. And I know you've been working at this for a few years, both in rural and urban areas, and really appreciate your contribution here.
Well, thank you, Steve and Miriam, and to all my fellow panelists for sharing your levels of innovation, commitment, and passion. It's all needed as we work to continue to move the needle on housing. I come to you from South Carolina, and I just want to lift up that I occupy the land of the people of the Wassamasaw and Edisto Natchez, people of the Low Country, and I constantly work to respect their legacy of the land that we inherited from them. The pandemic has highlighted the critical role that housing is playing in the community and social engagement, economic development. It is, in fact, the intersectionality between everything that causes us to live and causes us to thrive. And so we need to recognize, and I say we collectively as a society need to recognize the critical role housing and land plays in the vibrancy of a society. And so that means housing needs to be available for all. Unfortunately, that is not the policy environment we operate in South Carolina. Policy is not a priority of our state policymakers, our legislators. We do not have state appropriation consistently for affordable housing in South Carolina. We do have a housing finance agency that provides support for housing development, but 99% of that support largely comes from federal sources. The only source of state support for housing is a dock stamp fee that goes into a state housing trust fund that is made available for the production of affordable housing. I will say that there's tremendous support for housing coming from the private sector, from the community, from the banking sector, philanthropy, corporations, but it is not central to our state policymakers, but we think and hope, because of what has been demonstrated from the pandemic of how critical housing is to educating our children, to creating economic opportunities for families, for being able to be a social place for the community to gather and be one. We, the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development, have been advocating for housing and other community development policy priorities for over 20 years. We've been able to get some level of support for housing through a broad policy agenda we've called community economic development. And we framed our policy work in such a way that conservatives can recognize and understand the value of housing. They've not moved to the point of understanding it as a social good, but they do understand it as a key part to communities' thrivancy. And so that is the approach we've advocated, we've used to advocate for housing. And our coalition has been very broad. Our membership is over 150 diverse entities, but we've used that diversity to be able to engage policymakers from different policy perspectives so that they can understand that housing is important to urban and rural communities, is important to people of color, as well as the majority community. And so we have been able to advance a policy agenda with our state legislature around community economic development. We've been able to convince the legislature to enact something called the Community Economic Development Act, which authorizes the state to provide grants, loans, and tax credits to community-based organizations, not based on the agenda or the work they do, but who they are, which are democratically elected nonprofit organizations who on the ground are working on a variety of community development issues that includes housing. That legislation has been in effect since the year 2000. We've had to work to reauthorize it over that 20-year period. And we've been able to convince the legislature through that act to provide funding for a variety of community development activities that includes affordable housing. We're working to use that platform to help the broader community understand the centrality of housing to everything that we do, so that as we look at the different democratic approaches to housing, we'll be able to create a movement in the state that brings the issues and the relevance of housing, workforce development, economic opportunities to everyone in all sectors of our state. As you can imagine, people of color are ones that are affected most by poverty. And in South Carolina, for example, we have the highest eviction rate in the country. And a large part of those who are evicted are people of color. And so with a coalition of stakeholders, we work together to try to mitigate those issues of eviction so that people will not be removed from their houses. As I close my comments, I do think back to my own beginning as a child. Land and housing was a community commodity. It was not part of the economic framework, but it was something that we as a community protected, we passed on to the next generation. So we want to revisit some of the old strategies to make sure that land and community, land and housing became a central part of our community and is that asset on which we build and thrive and are able to move our community forward for equity and justice for all. So I'll stop there and see what thoughts may come from our audience.
All right, thanks Bernie so much. And hopefully other folks will get unmuted. And I'll start with we have a few questions that we're gonna ask, but I'm actually going to combine the first question with an audience question. So the original question is, what is housing and how is it conceived and how should we be conceiving it? And I want to add, because I thought this was a really good way that a listener put this, that housing and owning property, because it's thought of as such a market good, is seen as a fundamental part of building wealth in the United States. And how do we make that mental shift from housing as a wealth building tool to housing as a right and as and meeting a social need. So anybody who wants to jump in on that?
I have some thoughts here. I think citing literature with which I'm familiar, I've often heard housing defined as, well, Matthew Desmond in his work Evicted says that housing is a secure base from which to explore the world. Housing is the secure base for families, such that your success at work or at school depends on whether or not you have somewhere that you can comfortably lay your head at night. But there's also the Urban Fortunes, a book that folks on the left often cite, in which you learn about housing's exchange value and its use value. So typically among our politicians and among the neoliberal economists that guide so much of how housing is developed in this country, housing is known for the value it creates by constantly circulating through the economy instead of for its use value, what it means to me as a place where I live, where I work, where I build bonds with my neighbors. I think to get to the listener's question, I would say that for us to uncouple housing from this American dream of wealth creation, we would need to transform so much more of the social safety net. We would need to have multiple levers for economic security over the life course, such that people were not relying on their own on the small assets they have to provide for themselves into old age. And I think that's what everything is possible. If you look at the data, before the 1935 Social Security Act, before Medicare, before Medicaid, poverty among older adults was 1 in 3. After those transformations in the social safety net over the course of the 20th century, poverty among older adults is now 1 in 10, which is immoral, but that is a huge transformation. So I think if we were to be successful in a number of our policy demands on the left, if we were to be successful in a Green New Deal, if we were to be successful in getting supported employment, if we were to be successful in getting healthcare for all, if all these things were to come together such that people felt that they had their needs met, if we were to truly tax the rich to pay for these things, then housing and wealth creation would not be tethered together as closely as it has been in this country since its founding.
Great, thanks.
Great. So I want to combine also 2 audience questions, which is, so we have some questions here about how do we get the public support? So several of you mentioned we need public backing to make social housing happen. How do we get that? Where do we get that generation? And how do we particularly prevent the typical swings that may happen as political tides shift left and right to have a sustainable support for social housing?
Should I talk about some of that stuff?
That'd be great.
Okay, 30 seconds. And I apologize for over speaking during my last one. So I feel like we're at an inflection point with housing policy in this country. It feels like this eviction crisis is going to force some kind of answer that it cannot be just pushing the ball further along and extending it with vouchers. Think about how much money we're going to have to spend in vouchers to just put a Band-Aid on a broken system, right? So we think the moment is there. We actually think that powerful examples of what works, like the Encinitas Unidas in Minneapolis, like Dudley Street, can be very powerful. We think, too, that this kind of coalition around social housing will have to include some middle-class people. Also, one of the reasons that public housing got so maligned in this country compared to some other countries is that it became for the poor only. We want to establish social housing as a cornerstone where many different kinds of folks. Of course, we're going to have a racial justice, restorative, reparative lens, but it's going to have to include middle-class people also. And finally, just one other thing, we have to untangle so many of our institutions that are tied with the money-making of private housing. We're going to have to do something about the tax basis. You know, local politicians love it when housing prices go up so they can pay for schools. Why are schools paid for by local taxes, right? So we have to begin to untangle a lot of that kind of stuff.
Great. Thanks, Gianpaolo. I wanted to ask a question about, that it's clear that housing authority, there's the eviction crisis that's looming. Housing affordability, is becoming more and more tenuous for more and more people. And, what are the explanations that panelists have as to what's driving this increase in housing affordability and housing crisis?
Well, some of this right now, of course, is based on supply chain. In the production of affordable housing, we're looking right now, and it has been for some time, that the supply chain of what is needed to produce how affordable housing is disrupted, and those materials, the costs are increasing. But there's also the subsidies for making housing affordable are becoming more difficult to secure, and we have to be more creative on the financing side of how we finance and how we pay for the affordability of housing. So we've got to push those levers as well. And just back to the former question about how do we bring other stakeholders to the table, we have to engage some of those players from the financial sector. We have to engage the corporate sector. We have to engage the healthcare sector, as well as the business sector, to bring them to the table to help them understand the critical role that housing plays in making their agenda advance as well. Engaging both conservatives and progressives. In South Carolina, during this last legislative session, we had some of the more conservative legislators speaking on behalf of our community development agenda. So that can be done, but we definitely have to engage a broad sector, a broad array of stakeholders in the conversation about housing. But again, the areas that affect the production and the financing of housing, those levers continue to increase, and we have to work on more innovative strategies to make sure that the units are affordable as they go forward.
I respectfully disagree with Bernie in certain respects. I think that one of the reasons why so many people cannot afford their housing is because we've been engaging business. I think in this country since the 1970s at least, there's been this historic pivot in housing policy in which the federal government has decided that it does not want to compete with the private sector by constructing hard units of housing or by investing in housing in the manner that it did during the New Deal era. And instead, what the federal government's role is to fuel private housing production. So that's where you see something like the rise of a housing choice voucher, the rise of the low-income housing tax credit in 1986. But these sorts of tools are inherently inadequate. They're not enough to ensure a unit for everyone who needs one. If you speak to an urban economist about why housing is so expensive, they'll typically cite two gaps. The gap between the number of people who want an affordable unit and the number of affordable units that exist. So also talk about the gap between wages and rent. Wages have eroded since the 1970s, but household housing costs have risen exponentially since the 1970s. I think those sorts of explanations do get us somewhere, but I don't think that they're necessarily sufficient to explain our contemporary housing system. Do they speak to speculation? Do they speak to this historic rescission of the federal role in housing production? No. I think that this reconception of the state's role in housing is driving so much of the affordable housing crisis in this country. And I think that we need new approaches and new narratives as well to explain why we have the affordable housing crisis that we have, that will lead us to new solutions that will actually be sufficient to helping people. I don't think that merely bipartisanship and coming together around a milquetoast analysis is enough. I think we need to be rigorous and bold and hold people to account, hold power to account, when people in power are commanding systems or driving systems that are leading to suboptimal outcomes for the most vulnerable among us.
I want to also add to that. Well, first, I want to give love to our interpreters. Let's give some love to them. Maybe a little break, take a breath. Well, first of all, I can't be more likely to win the lottery than get on the wait list for public housing in Minneapolis. There's more than a 13,000 person wait list. Now that doesn't happen overnight, and that doesn't happen because we're just, it happens because we're operating business as usual with a concerted movement on the right to take away our rights on the left and poor people, essentially. And I think until we can untether ourselves from the system of white supremacy in housing, and I'm going to cite an example, we will get nowhere. Because take, for example, Felisa, single mother whose husband was deported with 5 children living in a bed-bug-infested apartment without any heat, all of a sudden gets from the educational system some of these warnings from a social services agency within the school saying that there's bed bugs in their arm, on the children's arm bites. And now what they try to do is they attempt to take the children away from the single brown mother, right? They're not even asking any questions about where they live, how they live, and create massive, intense trauma on the families without even saying, what if the landlord here is causing the violence? Now, if that's happening in our school systems, and I have 15 people working for one person when they're still giving the landlord the benefit of the doubt, who we sent to jail, by the way, it is absolutely, completely dishonest. And we need to open up our eyes about what is happening here. And so I would say we need movement-embedded policy, because policy is a hot air balloon and movements are anchors. And if we're anchored in movement, and we're anchored in where we want to go, and we're anchored in rent stabilization and territory and decommodifying land, this will inform our approaches. Now, that is not to say that it's only movement or bust. We need everyone to be working on policy in a lockstep with each other to talk about this farce, to talk about this, because landlords are violent. And until you understand that, we're not going to win. And I'm not talking about a small business landlord who has rent control already and treats their person nicely, who pays for their mortgage. I'm talking about massive corporate landlords. This is a difference. It's not the small businesses that are harming our societies. But we need to think about those 3 things: movement-embedded politics, untethering housing from white supremacy, and attacking the right to build on the left, so that we can get policy that makes sense for all of us.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I'm going to bring us back to a sort of fundamental question, one that we promised to talk about when we promoted this webinar, and a few people are asking, which is, can we get something of a definition of what we mean by social housing, and how is it different from public housing? Yeah, I think let's start there, and I'd like everybody to address it briefly. What's your elevator pitch on what it means?
I'll give an elevator pitch, but I want to hear from everybody else too. So when we look at housing, is it democratically and community controlled? Is it quality and permanently affordable? Is it intentionally inclusive? Is it publicly backed? And is it environmentally sound and aligned with the Green New Deal?
Anyone else want to jump in? Go for it.
Yes. So my definition of social housing was featured on the final slide in my remarks. So invoking the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Sherrod, I would define social housing as housing that is permanently affordable, housing that is democratically controlled, and housing that is rooted in racial and social equity.
So it's broader than public housing, the way that we understand public housing in this country, which has been solely government administered. just.
Can I say something about public housing too? So there's been a couple of questions in the chat box, and we on the left have to be very careful when we talk about public housing, but we have to have the courage to say what it does and what it doesn't do for people. So if it's top down and it's technocratically controlled and it treats people badly, doesn't get people to have the chance to control the conditions of their housing. If they kick you out for no reason, then it's not social housing. Then it's government controlled non-market housing. So we have to push for better, higher quality, more public housing, but that it has to be controlled. You know, Roberta was talking about anchored in community. It has to be controlled by community. That's the kind of vision that we have. So public housing, as we know, it could be social housing. Often it isn't.
Great. Well, I'll jump in. Does anyone else want to chime in on this question?
I wanted to say briefly as well on the public housing point, if we're conceiving of social housing as a racial housing agenda as well, then we know that the ways that public housing was erected in this country to cordon off and to create concentrated poverty pockets for largely Black and brown folks, that is anathema to our vision of social housing. Public housing in this country in many ways was used to build segregation into the heavens with towers in the park. That is not our vision for social housing. Social housing would be bringing people together, would be enriching and integrating communities in a manner that is conducive to human flourishing, not in a manner that's rooted in racial degradation and subjugation for Black and brown folks.
Great. Well, I wanted to bring in a question from the audience. You know, it says, it notes that, well, you know, essentially, you know, there are multiple crises here, and one of them is environmental as well as the social housing crisis. You know, and how can social housing actually be a tool for addressing issues of carbon emissions and actually, you know, both serving people's social needs and the needs of the planet at the same time?
We've talked a lot about this in our cooperative. We have the potential, once we get the finance and our model set up, to generate within our community almost $1 million. The question is what we do with those $1 million. And we said in our movement that we do crisis energy management, because when we go into buildings, we stop leaks that are happening 24/7. We stop drafty windmills because we're forcing repairs. We do these things that, you know, will stop waste, but we want to take it a step further. And so there's a lot of conversation here. There's a coalition of organizations, of base organizations in Minneapolis that's looking at redevelopment from below and redevelopment from the left after the uprising and the burning of buildings, which accomplished a lot in Minneapolis, by the way. But I just want to say, thinking about development from a people-centered approach is necessary. And I think that people deeply want it. And I think we'll be able to build and create work from the solar panel installations, the permaculture gardens, these kind of different things that all connect us deeper into why we're doing what we're doing. I think somebody told me once that when we start to decommodify housing, you're gonna have to unlearn everything you think you know. And that's clear. We really don't know where we're going, but we know that if we come together and we transform together, that we can create something that is very vastly qualitatively different than where we came from. And so when I ask the people of the cooperative, why do we even want this cooperative? Well, should we just be a landlord? Like, this is the people's response. They say, I never want to go through what I had to go through again, and I don't want anyone else to go through that. And so I think that is just a very clear dream of creating something that has been so oppressive on the people that's very different.
Great. So I want to build on the question of the sense that we've been talking about movements several times, and there's a question from the audience about, so what is housing's Affordable Care Act? What is housing's Medicare for all? More, that's better than the Affordable Care Act if we're looking at actually building new institutions. So there's the homes guarantee, there's the Green New Deal, and there was a question of where is this energy? And I would say I'm seeing a lot of this energy in the housing justice and tenant organizing fields, but I'd like to hear from the panelists, where's the energy for the movement to make this change? Where do you see it most promising? And what are the campaigns that they're undertaking? While you're thinking, I will also shout out the New Deal for Housing Justice and the Breathe Act, both of which have significant components referring to social housing.
I would like to briefly shout out my comrade, Jasmine Sanchez in New York City, who's mobilizing DSA and the Sunrise Movement around a Green New Deal for public housing. I know earlier was mentioned, how do we ensure that we're thinking about the climate crisis as we're thinking about social housing? I think Jasmine is someone who's really leading on this front, mobilizing public housing residents to demand the dignified conditions they deserve to live in, while also thinking about the fact that so many of the public housing developments in New York City are in low-lying areas. What might that mean in the coming decades? That sort of intersectional environmentalism is really of interest to me, and I'm heartened by the way that Black and Brown people are intervening in an environmental movement in a manner to broaden and expand it to ensure that we're best positioned to make the changes that we need to make to win.
Great. I'm going to ask, go ahead.
Just quickly, I think what was unique when we first started our movement, it was a struggle for repairs that then led to a struggle of rent increases, that then led to a struggle of owning and being autonomous in our own buildings which we lived in. And I think as we went more profound, we started to see that it was the system, the market-based capitalist system, that was creating a lot of the deep oppression within Minneapolis City. And something that was just very clear in the guts of the people is, how do we connect? You can go into any neighborhood, well, not any, go into a neighborhood where we're dealing with struggle and ask people if they want rent control. See what they say. And I think it's something in the guts of the people. But connected to rent control and rent stabilization in our cities, which was banned in the 1970s, is this idea of tenant opportunity to purchase, where tenants get first right of refusal to their buildings and to where they're living. And then this whole idea of building territory. So I think a struggle for repairs leads to a struggle against the market, because the market is benefiting the 1% over the people, that then leads to a struggle of building territory and getting land back for creating autonomous territory and moving forward.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to ask, there was a question, Gianpaolo, about the sort of the mechanics of the social housing model. And so if you could, and the questioner is asking, is this something that's just applicable in weak market cities, whether it's vacant property, or is it also applicable in hot market cities? And how does it work in the different types of housing markets?
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things about the mechanics of the Social Housing Development Authority, and we'll put up the proposal in the chat box for people who want to see and send us feedback. So one of the things that we feel very strongly about is that the Social Housing Development Authority needs to be anchored in movements. So the board of the authority would have both very strong local representation, but have a national board that's composed mostly of people of color, tenants, and people outside of the real estate industry with some government representation. Second, we feel very strongly that the SHDA needs to be free from the congressional appropriations process. If you look at the history of public housing, the directors of the public housing authorities in this country, every year they release the same statement. You're cutting us out, you're reducing our funding. Public housing is just a convenient punching bag. So the Social Housing Development Authority needs to be capitalized from the beginning and needs to have the ability to generate some of its own resources. to maintain that autonomy. So it needs to be rooted in movements, needs to be accountable to movements, and needs to have the fiscal autonomy to be able to do it. And then before someone says that's impossible, well, the Department of Education works like that. During the Trump era, there was this bank called the BUILD, International Development Bank, $600 billion that it could just issue. So that's the kind of scale. We feel that, so the Social Housing Development Authority has the capacity to build new social housing as well as purchase distressed housing. We think right now we're in a moment of decline, so it's a counter-cyclical policy, purchase a lot of distressed real estate. Of course, that's going to work differently in Detroit or in deindustrialized areas like North Adams, Massachusetts, in rural areas as it's come back, than in hot markets. But in hot markets, it's going to have to do the same. And the idea of a federal authority is that it's able to balance. So it doesn't need to break even everywhere. And the final thing about the mechanics is that for this to work, and that people ask us this question all the time, it will require a permanent subsidy. There's no math in the universe that's going to be able to give everyone permanent, affordable, quality housing that's not going to require spending. We're not going to create cooperatives that are suddenly going to be self-sustaining and economically viable. That's a myth. But we need to ask ourselves as we shift, as Roberto says, we shift to another way of thinking about housing, another way of thinking about commodity. It's about thinking about our priorities. Think of all the money we spend on policing. Think of all the money we spend on the carceral state. Think of all the money we spend subsidizing private mortgages and segregation. So it's a matter of priorities. But please do send an email if you have questions about the specifics and how it might work in your area. We're very actively involved. And finally, Miriam asked the question about where we see the energy. There is a Housing Justice Roundtable, Right to the City, National Housing Justice for All, People's Action, Center for Popular Democracy. There's about 200 housing advocacy movements that are part of this new, super exciting network.
Something that was peculiar to me is when we did a large campaign on the north side of Minneapolis, in which we won homes in a community land trust, as well as 2 years of rent subsidy based on the neglect that people had gone through under this landlord, and a pathway for new public housing and also ownership for the families who had lived in this previous portfolio. And somehow, when we started organizing and we started kind of putting them on blast, and we started winning, it was peculiar to me that all of a sudden the housing authority found 2 years of subsidy for more than 30 Black families. And I was like, okay, like, where is this money coming from? So there's money. There's always money in places, and there's always a potential to do it. It's just if there's a willpower or not.
The United States is the richest country in the history of Earth. How can we have this housing deficit? I mean, it's really a matter of priorities. Lots of poorer countries do way better job.
Indeed. And so do you all have then examples? So we have organizing win examples. Do we have policy win examples? And also, can you talk a little bit about market differences? So there's a couple questions about the Social Housing Development Authority would be buying distressed properties. How does it function in places where the cost of housing and land is higher? And that connects to another question we have about all these corporate entities, the landlords, the private equity firms that have land that they haven't developed yet, and how we might get access to that land and shift that dynamic.
So the people to look to actually who are experts at this kind of mechanic questions are the Washington, D.C. Topa-Copa folks, because they have figured out a very nice system of monitoring, of advising and identifying. And Washington, D.C. is not a cheap market. And what the Topa-Copa legislation there does is it, in that process of selling it to tenants, it prevents a kind of a speculative move. They have a kind of double bite system. In other countries, in Spain, for example, you're able to just purchase a distressed property and you as a government are able to name a price. In this country, maybe Crystal knows different, but some of the lawyerly folks in our orbits are saying, that's unconstitutional and possibly communistic. So don't even think about stuff like that. Elmer is agrees with me. So yes, it would work differently. One of the things that the SHCA would do, though, is also buy non-residential real estate in some of these hot markets and turn it over to residential. For example, shopping malls, office building. There's gazillion empty hotels in hot markets like New York, for example, at the moment. So it would do that. I wish I could tell you we had a kind of magic formula that would somehow reduce the cost of it. But I'll say, at the moment in hot markets, if the alternative to purchasing and turning it over to communities is vouchers, we're spending a lot on vouchers to keep people housed and not having a public stake over those purchases. We're just giving money to the private sector and to landlords and to corporate landlords. And our view is we're going to have to spend money on housing. Let's do it in a way that gives people control over it.
Try again. There we go. I don't know how that happened. All right. Well, I wanted to, there were questions from, I wanted to get Bernie back in the conversation a little bit. So there was a question, I think, from somebody in Texas about housing policy. And obviously the politics of a Texas or South Carolina are somewhat different than the politics of Minnesota. How do you see the possibility for advancing these notions that would actually provide more affordable housing for all?
Well, like I said earlier, we operate in a very conservative environment, and we have to engage. If we're going to make movement happen, at least for now, we have to engage those levers of power, and we do. And we use the tools and the resources at our disposal. But at the same time, we are organizing folk at the community level and helping them to understand their voice, helping to strengthen their voice so that they can engage their policymakers right where they live. So our approach and our advocacy efforts have centered around creating a conversation and using language that those that are in power can absorb, can understand what we're trying to say, and then to be able to enact certain policies that will help us move the agenda forward. I will quickly say that our approach is one of many. And I would also say that what we're working with by no means addresses the huge challenge we have with affordable housing and the issues around housing. For example, like I said earlier, South Carolina has one of the highest eviction rates in the country. And so we have to push our policymakers to be able to move resources and prioritize resources in a way that's going to meet the needs of the community. So it's like a top-down, bottom-up approach. There are those of us who have connections with conservative policymakers that can speak to them in ways that they can understand. But we also work aggressively with grassroots voices on the ground, helping them to understand their voice and to be able to encourage them to engage their legislators, their council members, their mayors, right where they are. And we're beginning to see some changes happening there. So it's a very complex approach. It's a very comprehensive approach. And we see ourselves really on a continuum, because this is work that going to have to happen over decades. It's going to still be working far beyond the time that I'm here. But we are beginning to see some small steps forward with the efforts that we're involved with.
Thanks, Bernie. And that connects to a question we have about housing prices and real estate manipulation has been used to drive political representation, gerrymandering, access to credit. How much pushback do you expect from those factors? And how do you, I will add, how do you incorporate the understanding of those power dynamics into the push to get social housing?
Well, the only piece I'll contribute is that, you have market forces. Market forces are going to operate as they operate. What we try to do is to, for now, put incentives in place to help mitigate those market forces. Again, they are a small part of a larger picture, but we do try to put the kind of incentives in place so that the market will recognize the importance of the work that we do in our agenda, such as tax credits, such as working with land trusts, land banks, so that we can assemble and control land, and then to be able to make that land available for the long term with housing development. And then, of course, building the capacity of those organizations, CDCs and CDFIs and others that are on the ground to actually put the units in place. We have a tremendous deficit in affordable housing units. And so we are working to provide the resources to build the capacity of those institutions to be able to provide the inventory that's needed. But I will talk about, and Crystal spoke earlier about institutionalization. As we're working on the movements, we also have to work on creating those institutions that are lasting and that will be able to be embedded in our greater system so that this work can continue. So those, I would say, that's a large part of what we're doing now is creating and strengthening those institutions that can do this work over the long haul. But when you talk about land prices, when you're talking about hot markets and what can be done in those hot markets, it is about engaging a variety of stakeholders and using a lot of different tools to be able to make those properties available for affordability. We have to also include strategies such as inclusionary zoning that will ensure or help our cities to be able to include affordable housing in the land zoning strategies as well. So there are a variety of tools, a variety of approaches that we're trying to use in the South to be able to make housing central to the economic equation.
Great, thanks, Bernie. So there's a question here there's a couple questions. Some of this is directed, I think, at Crystal, some of it's directed at all of you, but how do we meld the need to ramp up resources with social housing with the broad agenda for racial and economic justice? And if that's not enough, you can tackle the other question, which is like, how does this fit into the reparations discussion?
I mean, I offered some ideas at the top of the session with respect to harking back to Black-led models to organize housing that's permanently affordable, democratically controlled. And I think this is something that I'm still grappling with myself. I was in a call months ago with the economist Derek Hamilton, and I actually posed the question to him: if we know that we know that redistribution is central to our vision of social equity as leftists, we also know as Black folks that that redistribution must be targeted to repair from the intentional harms that we face in this country. And how do we mobilize towards a future of social housing while also mobilizing towards a future that is racially just? And if racial justice requires wealth creation for Black people, does that negate the sort of communal institutional arrangements that our leftist values tell us to erect? Professor Hamilton said that he responded humorously, and he said that it's younger folks who care so much about the distinction between left and center, between socialism and sort of liberal market economics. An asset is an asset. So if the federal government is willing to invest in community-controlled housing, we should take it. If the federal government is willing to invest into home ownership, we should take it. We need to get resources into folks' hands however we can. And it was a funny moment. I'm not quite sure that I'm there yet. I think that we need to, I don't have all the answers on this. I think that folks on the left, especially people of color, need to come together and articulate an agenda that ensures that we are made whole while also building towards a future that is rooted in solidarity. Because these things sometimes there's friction between these two things in certain moments. And I think in organizing spaces, you can feel that that friction is often palpable in our conversations and how we mobilize together and how we interact with one another.
The curious case in Minneapolis, citing the class action lawsuit. So this is public documents that you can research, and there's some pretty powerful briefings. Essentially there was a rent return of upwards around $18 million. Of that 18, 12 million went back into tenants' pockets. And this case demonstrated that systemic violence was happening on BIPOC communities, mainly Black and Latinx mothers, and that because of that, rent should be returned. Now, that was a rent return from when you lived in the apartments from 2012 to 2017. And I want to use this example because if in the highest court of laws, we were able to get a sort of reparations based on how landlords were committing violence on communities, what would it look like across the United States if we started from the supposition that the rent that they have been taking from us in our communities is actually theft, and that it needs to be returned in order to actually rebuild, recreate, and reconstruct a different place. And people were able to finally leave those apartments because these apartments become quicksand. You come into them, you can't leave, you're faced with fees, you get 8 evictions on your record because that's how they move people. You stay there, you can't go somewhere else. And then it becomes profit traps for the landlord, essentially, which is very scary. And so I want to just posit that example as a way to recreate, rethink a potential housing reparations policy in the United States.
I just want to add briefly, and there's not enough time to get into it, but I think we should complicate the question and the assumption that home ownership is a way to build wealth as opposed to a way to store wealth for people who already have it, and be addressing other ways of building wealth, which we'll be looking at in the coming months or later this year. But right now I wanted to ask, a couple of people have mentioned the American Rescue Plan, and I will add to that the infrastructure bill that's currently being discussed. How do you see the opportunities, possibly the dangers of interacting with the American Rescue Plan funding and the discussion around the infrastructure bill in terms of social housing and racial equity? Bernie, you want to start?
Yeah, we're in South Carolina, we see this as a moment of transformation. We see these resources. South Carolina will receive in American Rescue Plan funding over $8 billion, but $2.5 billion of that, the legislature will be deciding how those funds are deployed. And so we're developing an agenda that we think will play a role in affordable housing production, but also not only affordable housing production, but setting out new examples of investment in affordable housing. We're also putting forward an agenda that will impact BIPOC business ownership and wealth creation among people of color. And we're also looking at how we can deal with health with these resources. So we think some strategic investments through the American Rescue Plan that will also demonstrate the kind of models that we think can be institutionalized in South Carolina could set the table for a new trajectory for racial equity and addressing poverty, long-term sustainable poverty, or long-term systemic poverty, have that transform and change in the years to come. So we're very excited about it and going to be very aggressive about our advocacy efforts around those resources.
Great, thanks, Bernie. I think I want to close with this last question. It's about churches, but I'm going to expand it. So, the question is, if churches like local congregations want to support social housing in their area, where do they have the greatest leverage? But I think you could ask that same question about nonprofits, about co-ops, other folks who are on this call. How can people support the movement in their own communities?
I was actually trying to type an answer to that question. As someone that's involved, very active in a Christian denomination, and unfortunately seeing a number of congregations closing, and now seeing, I think, folk rethinking how they engage in their faith and in how those traditions are carried out. I think now it's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take a lot of rethinking how people connect with communities of faith. But those assets, those physical land assets and property assets, we have a huge opportunity to rethink how mission is done in that regard. And I'll just say a personal example. My church, I'm United Methodist. My church sits in the middle of one of the hot markets for housing development. Not a single unit that's being developed around our church is affordable. Not a single one. So my church is, as a matter of fact, this Sunday we'll be meeting with one of our nonprofit developers so that we can transform some of the land that we have into affordable housing. We think that is a new opportunity, especially in the South, in the Bible Belt, where we have churches that are closing, and those assets can be converted into community and social enterprises that will help move the needle on poverty. My faith tradition lifts up poverty as a high order of work that we should be about. And so we're going to be really pushing faith communities to make those assets available for the issues to address poverty, at the center of it, housing.
Thanks. Roberto, I know you work with faith communities as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many beautiful ways in which people have been able to kind of hook into the movement once they just asked themselves that main question and started listening to the communities around them. And I think we've seen really cool people in congregations throw down for our movement by hosting parties, doing actions with us, supporting tenants in a myriad of ways. But I think something that is coming to mind and thinking about the question of the big social programs around money that's going to be offered is that I think that we need to look at this with a wary eye because, you know, they created these affordable housing practices, these LIHTCs, essentially built affordable housing for free, said it's going to be affordable for 10 years, made billions on it, got politicians to vote on it, and then coercively went against the people who were trying to fight against and fight for tenants' rights, like rent stabilization. So a politician could say, we're going to build this affordable housing, but we're going to be against rent stabilization and we're going to be against TOPA. And then after the 10-year or 15-year limit of affordability came up, they resold their buildings for the ones that they bought for free, gentrified the neighborhood, and kicked us out. And so I think we need to filter ourselves through movement, through people who are actively engaging and seeing how we can potentially use this money for good, but also do it in such a way that doesn't gonna put us in a worse situation down the line.
Great, and we're kind of at time, but maybe brief comments from Crystal and Gianpaolo to close out. Crystal?
I would say the question about how might folks on the call engage in advancing social housing. I think Roberto got it right in that once you've asked that question, the answer is often found with folks who are closest to the problem. So whoever in your community is living with housing instability, whoever in your community is mobilizing in resistance to housing instability, I think those are the sort of folks to whom we should be directing these questions, and then you should be building power with them to craft distinct, locally rooted solutions to the housing issues in your area. Yeah, and I think there was another point I wanted to build off on another point that Roberto made. I think that what Roberto has said and what Bernie has said can coexist. I think that there are many. In particular, I want to celebrate the work of community development corporations across the country who are going to make good use of some of the new federal dollars in developing affordable units in their communities that they know well. But I also think that we have to be wary of more of the same. We know that the existing federal programs for housing provision are inadequate, and they're often designed to fuel the private market and to enrich syndicators and investors and actors who are not on the ground and do not make use of this housing and have no sense of who this housing is serving. And we have to question that and then design new models, such as the social housing we've been discussing, that can supplant what the federal government currently has on offer. I'll stop there. Okay,
thanks. Gianpaolo, brief last comment.
All of the above. I think we're living at a moment of transformation, an inflection point. We're asking questions in movements that we weren't asking a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. So when people in communities, we have to connect to other people who are making the road in other communities. There's lots of experimentation happening around the country right now. And I think we need to ask for the big things. So the American, I was disappointed the recent round of federal stuff did not include social housing. Relies on, designed to fail market mechanisms that are going to enrich people. We're addicted to too much of the same. And I think we can't let this moment pass. I think big things are afoot, but we have to seize it. We have to make it happen.
Great. We do need to wrap up. Thanks to everyone for your questions. We got to as many of them as we could. I want to thank our interpreters, Elmer and Gladys, thanks so much. My co-moderator, Miriam Axelut from Shelter Force, and all of the panelists, Roberto de la Riva, Gianpaolo Baiocchi, Crystal Okafor, and Bernie Masik. Thanks everyone, and We will be sending out the recording and slides, so you will get those, and expect them, in your inbox, by Monday or Tuesday of next week. So thanks so much.